I want to say up front that I'm not a superstitious person. I did 4 years of undergrad in biochem, 4 years of med school, 3 years of family medicine residency in a hospital with a helicopter pad and a level 2 trauma bay, and none of that prepares you to believe in anything you can't put on a slide. I'm telling you that so you understand what it took to shake that out of me. Because it did get shaken out of me, and I'm not entirely sure it's grown back. This was 2015. I took a 2-year contract with the Indian Health Service, a solo family practice position in a town I'll call Kettner, population around 1,100, on a reservation in the high desert of the Southwest. I won't be more specific than that, partly for the privacy of the people I treated, and partly because I still have family who visit that part of the country, and I'd rather not have this dredged up by name. The clinic was one building, exam rooms, a small lab, a pharmacy window, my office, attached to a 2-bed observation unit that we used maybe twice a month, mostly for people who needed IV fluids overnight before the 40-minute drive to the real hospital made sense. I was it. There was a nurse practitioner who came up from the regional office every other Thursday, and a dentist who flew in once a quarter. But day to day, for anything short of call the ambulance, I was the doctor in Kettner. I liked it. I want that on the record too. The isolation that made the job hard was also what made it good. I knew my patients. I knew the Ordway family had 3 generations of the same startlingly low blood pressure, and I stopped ordering repeat cardiac workups on people who fainted standing up too fast, because I'd seen the pattern for 2 years running. Rural medicine like that is mostly pattern recognition and mostly boring, in the best way. Boring is what you want in a body. The first thing that didn't fit was so small, I didn't write it down anywhere except my own memory. And even now, I go back and forth on whether it means anything. A man named Del Yazzie, not his real name, came in for a follow-up on a knee injection I'd given him 6 weeks earlier. Steroid shot. Standard stuff. Mild osteoarthritis and a 61-year-old rancher who'd been on his feet doing physical labor since he was about 9. I pulled his chart before I went in, the way I always did, refreshing myself on what we'd discussed. The note said we'd talked about his blood pressure medication compliance, that he admitted to skipping doses, that I'd counseled him on it, and he'd agreed to try a pillbox. I went in and asked him how the pillbox was working out. He looked at me like I'd asked him about a pet he'd never owned. He said he'd never missed a dose of that medication in his life, that his late wife used to fill his pillbox every Sunday before she passed, and he'd kept doing it himself, out of respect for her memory. That in fact we'd spent most of the last visit talking about his grandson's football season, not blood pressure at all. I remember laughing it off. I told him I must have him confused with another patient. Plausible, I saw 20, 25 people a day. My notes were sometimes dictated at 10 at night, when the day's details had already gone soft in my head. I apologized. We talked about the football season I apparently should have remembered, and I gave him his knee shot and sent him home. I did go back and check though, not because I was worried, just because doctors like closing loops. I pulled the audit log on the chart. Our EHR kept a timestamp and a login for every note, and the note in question had been dictated by me, time-stamped correctly, 6 weeks prior, no edits, no other user access. It was my note, my login, my dictation, in my own turn of phrase, the Council on Compliance language I always used. I just hadn't said any of it to Del Yazzie. Or he'd forgotten an entire 20-minute conversation, including agreeing to a pillbox he later swore he'd used for over a decade already. I let it go. People misremember things, especially with medication conversations that blur together across a dozen doctors over a lifetime. I didn't think about it again for close to 2 months. The second time was harder to explain away, and it involved a young mother named Bernice. Again, not her real name. who I'd been seeing for prenatal care. She was in her 3rd trimester. Healthy pregnancy. No complications, the kind of patient that made the job feel good. At one visit, she asked me, almost in passing, why I'd told her at her last appointment that the baby was breech. The baby was not breech. I had documented at that prior visit. A normal vertex presentation confirmed on Leopold's maneuvers, which is the hands-on technique we use to feel how the baby is lying. And I remembered doing it. I remembered the specific conversation where I told her everything looked head down and on track. She insisted, gently, almost apologetically, like she didn't want to argue with her doctor, that I had told her the baby might need to be turned and that we'd need to discuss it at the next visit. I checked the chart in front of her, my note, my exam findings. Vertex, confirmed, no concerns raised. I read it to her out loud. She got a strange look on her face. Not defensive. Not like she thought I was gaslighting her. More like someone trying to remember which of 2 nearly identical dreams actually happened. And said, quietly, maybe I'm thinking of someone else. There wasn't anyone else. There was no other doctor in Kettner. She would have had to be thinking of a doctor from a different pregnancy, a different town, a different decade. And she wasn't. She knew that. I could see her knowing that and deciding not to say it. I started, after that, keeping my own private log. Not in the EHR. In a paper notebook I kept in my desk drawer, where I jotted down anything a patient said that didn't match my memory or my documentation of a visit. I told myself it was for quality assurance. I didn't examine too closely why I felt the need to keep it somewhere the hospital system couldn't see. Over about 4 months, I collected 11 instances. Small stuff mostly. A man who remembered me diagnosing his rash as poison ivy, when my note clearly, unambiguously documented shingles, complete with the classic dermatomal band I'd sketched by hand in a margin, because I liked to draw exactly where a rash sat. A teenage boy who insisted I'd cleared him for football when my notes said the opposite. That I'd held him out over a suspected concussion and told his mother to watch him for 48 hours. An elderly woman, Louise, who thanked me profusely for the referral I'd apparently given her to a cardiologist in the city, a referral that did not exist anywhere in her chart, in our referral tracking system, or in my own memory of ever having that specific conversation. Because as far as I knew, and as far as her chart showed, her heart was fine. Here's the part that actually scared me, more than any single mismatch detail. None of these people seemed troubled by the discrepancy for more than a few seconds. They'd note it, almost puzzled, and then move on, the way you'd shrug off forgetting where you put your keys. It was me who couldn't move on. I started to wonder, seriously, clinically, whether I was the one with the problem. Early on said something, a lesion somewhere doing something to my memory that I hadn't caught in myself. The way doctors are famously the last people to diagnose their own decline. I made an appointment with a neurologist in the city on one of my days off, 4 hours round trip, and had a full workup. MRI, cognitive battery, the works. Everything came back clean. Frustratingly, almost insultingly clean given what I was going through. I want to describe one visit specifically because it's the one that ended this phase of things for me, permanently. An old man named Harlan. I'll keep the pseudonym simple since it's the one he actually went by informally. Everyone in town called him Harlan, regardless of what was on his birth certificate. Had been on my panel since my first month in Kettner. He was somewhere north of 80, sharp as anything, came in every 6 weeks like clockwork for medication management of a heart condition that was frankly being managed beautifully. Low-key guy, dry sense of humor. Always brought me a jar of something his granddaughter had canned. At what would turn out to be our second to last visit, he sat down across from me and said, without any preamble, "You told me last time I had maybe a year left in me." I had not told him that. I remembered the visit specifically. We'd spent most of it discussing whether to add a second blood pressure medication, and I told him honestly that his numbers looked better than men half his age. I pulled the chart up in front of him, turned the screen so he could see it, and read him my own note. Excellent control. Continue current regimen. Return in 6 weeks. He read it. He nodded slowly. And then he said something I have not been able to shake in 9 years. Well, that's not what I remember you saying to me, but I suppose I know which one of us is more likely to be right. He died 11 months later, peacefully, at home, of what the coroner ultimately attributed to a cardiac event consistent with his known condition. Nothing suspicious. Nothing that pointed to any failure of care on my part. 11 months. Not quite a year. Close enough that I have never been able to fully convince myself it was coincidence. And not close enough that I can point to it as proof of anything either. I finished my 2-year contract. I did not renew it. I want to be careful here, because I don't think anything supernatural happened in that clinic. Not in any sense I could defend to a colleague. I think it's more likely that isolation does something to a solo practitioner's mind that residency and fellowship never warn you about. The sheer cognitive load of being the only doctor for 1,100 people, dictating notes, half asleep, holding an entire town's medical history alone in your own head, with no partner to double-check you against. I think memory is a much less reliable instrument than we like to pretend, for patients and doctors both, and that somewhere in the friction between an exhausted rural doctor's recollection and an exhausted patient's recollection, something in one of us slipped, repeatedly, in a pattern too specific and too one-directional for me to explain to my own satisfaction. That's the generous read. The other read is the one I have at 3 a.m. sometimes. 9 years later, when I think about Harlan reading his own chart back to himself and just nodding, like he already knew it wasn't going to match what he remembered. Like some part of him understood, before I did, that the paper wasn't ever really the thing keeping accurate track of him. I don't keep the notebook anymore. I burned it, actually, the week before I left Kedner, which is a strange thing for a scientist to admit to doing, and an even stranger thing to admit felt necessary. I did 4 years as the sole overnight physician at a 22-bed critical access hospital in the upper Midwest. I'll call the town Aldrich Falls, though that's not what's on any map. It's the kind of hospital that exists because the alternative is a 90-minute drive to the nearest real ER. And for a farming community with an aging population and a lot of icy roads in January, 90 minutes might as well be never. I worked nights, 7 on, 7 off, alone in the building except for 2 nurses and whichever tech had drawn the short straw that week. Aldrich Falls General had 6 inpatient beds. Technically, though we rarely had more than 2 or 3 occupied at once. Mostly elderly pneumonia, the occasional post-op observation for the general surgeon who came through twice a week, a diabetic in DKA every so often. Bed 4 was at the end of the hall, closest to the nurse's station, which should have made it the most desirable bed, the one with the fastest response time. It was, structurally, no different from beds 1 through 3. Same wall-mounted oxygen, same call light, same view of the parking lot, through the same blinds. Nobody would say it out loud for my first 8 or 9 months there. But nobody wanted to put a patient in bed 4 if they could help it. I found out why by accident. The way you find out most things in a small hospital? Not from a formal briefing, but from a night nurse named Carol who'd worked there since before I was born, more or less, and who let it slip while we were charting side by side at 3 a.m. during a slow shift. She said, apropos of very little, "You notice we try to keep 4 empty when we can." I hadn't consciously noticed, but once she said it, I realized I had in fact noticed exactly that pattern. without registering it. I asked her why. She was quiet for a second, the particular quiet of someone deciding whether you're the kind of doctor who'll think she's foolish. Then she told me that over the years, she wouldn't put a number on it, but more than makes sense. Patients in bed 4 had a habit of reporting, a night or two before they either died or took a sudden and unexpected turn for the worse, that someone had come and sat with them, sat on the edge of the bed. Specifically, which nurses notice because it's an actual physical event, a mattress depressing under weight, not just a feeling. The patients described it consistently across years and across each other, without having any way to have coordinated the description. An older man, plainly dressed, who didn't say much, who they mostly remembered as being kind, patient, unhurried. Some of them thought he was a relative visiting. Some of them thought he was another patient wandering the hall. A few, later, when directly asked, said they'd assumed he was a chaplain, since the hospital did have one who made rounds, though our actual chaplain was a woman in her 30s named Deb, who absolutely did not match that description, and who, when I eventually and somewhat sheepishly asked her about it directly, had heard the same stories from patients and had no idea who they meant either. I did what I think most physicians would do with a story like that from a nurse at 3 a.m. I filed it under hospital folklore, thanked her for the color, and went back to my chart notes. I did not believe it. I want to be clear that I did not believe it for a long time. The first time I had a patient in bed for myself was maybe 6 weeks after that conversation. An 85-year-old man, I'll call him Gordon, admitted for a UTI that had tipped into mild sepsis. Common enough in the elderly, usually resolves fine with IV antibiotics and fluids. And Gordon was trending the right direction by the time I did my overnight check. Vitals stable, mentating well, joking with the nurse about the hospital food, unremarkable. I had no particular reason to think about him again that night beyond a routine check-in. At around 4 a.m., the nurse paged me because Gordon had rung his call light. "Not urgent," she said. "He just wanted to talk to a doctor for a minute." I went in expecting a med question or a request for a different pillow, the kind of overnight page that's 90% reassurance and 10% actual clinical concern. Gordon was sitting up, alert, vitals fine on the monitor, and he asked me, in a completely conversational tone, whether his brother had signed in with hospital security or whether he'd just wandered back to visit directly. I told him I wasn't aware of any visitors. It was 4 a.m, the hospital doors were locked, visiting hours had ended 9 hours earlier, and nobody buzzes in at 4 a.m. without the front desk calling me first, since I was the only physician in the building and any visitor at that hour would have been unusual enough to mention. Gordon said that was strange because his brother had just been sitting right there on the end of the bed for a good 10 or 15 minutes, hadn't said much, mostly just sat with him the way he used to when they were boys and their mother was sick, and had left maybe 2 minutes before he rang the call light. I want to be very precise about what I felt in that moment, because I think it's important. I did not feel afraid. I felt the specific, cold professional alertness of a doctor who suspects a patient is having a neurological or metabolic event, a stroke, a worsening of the sepsis with delirium setting in, some new insult I'd missed on my earlier check. I ran a full recheck on the spot. Repeat vitals, oxygen saturation, a fingerstick glucose, a rapid neuro exam. Everything was normal. Gordon was alert and oriented to person, place, time, and situation. He knew what day it was, why he was in the hospital, who I was. He was not confused in any way that matched what a septic delirium or a stroke would produce. He was calm, almost pleased actually about the visit. I asked him carefully whether his brother was still living. He said no. His brother had died 6 years earlier. But he said it the way you'd mention any ordinary fact about a family member, not the way someone in the grip of a hallucination or a break from reality says something. There was no disorientation in it, no confusion between past and present. He knew his brother was dead. He was telling me, as a fact he was fully aware of, that his dead brother had come and sat with him for 15 minutes at 4 a.m, in bed 4, and that this did not particularly alarm him. I ordered a full septic workup redo anyway. Repeat labs, a chest x-ray to rule out any new process, kept him under closer observation for the rest of the night. Everything came back reassuring. He was discharged 3 days later, fully recovered, in genuinely good spirits. And as far as I know, he lived another several years after that. I want to say that clearly because this isn't a story about a death omen that played out on cue. Gordon did not die. Nothing bad happened to Gordon at all, as far as I ever learned. He just had a visit, in that bed, from someone who by any conventional accounting could not have been there, and it didn't seem to bother him, and it has never stopped bothering me. Over the rest of my 4 years at Aldrich Falls, I documented, privately, not in any chart, because there was no clinical reason to and every professional reason not to. 5 more incidents that fit the same pattern. Not identical every time. Sometimes the visitor was described as a woman. Once, a patient described someone I didn't know. Just an old fella, real polite, with no family resemblance claimed at all. But always bed for, always overnight. Always someone sitting on the edge of the bed for a while and then leaving. Always reported by the patient calmly, without confusion or fear. Often, almost gratefully, and always. This is the part I truly cannot explain away with any tired doctor, understaffed hospital, elderly patient confusion theory that I've tried on myself many times. Always corroborated independently by nurses who hadn't spoken to each other about it, who each separately mentioned noticing the mattress on the edge of bed 4 visibly compressed, as if someone had recently been sitting there when they went in to check on the patient, minutes after the patient described the visitor leaving. I never once caught anything on the security footage. We had a single camera at the end of that hallway, covering the nurses' station and the approach to the rooms, not inside the rooms themselves, for patient privacy reasons, and it never showed anyone entering or leaving bed 4 during any of these incidents. Nobody walked down that hall. The door didn't open. Whatever the nurses felt when they pressed a hand into that compressed spot on the mattress, it didn't correspond to anyone who came or went through any route the camera could see. I asked, eventually, whether bed 4 had any particular history, that someone died there under bad circumstances. Was there some story attached to the room that predated Carol's tenure? Nobody could point to anything specific. The hospital had been renovated twice since it opened in the 1950s. The beds themselves weren't original. Nothing about the room's construction was different from beds 1 through 3. No records existed, as far as our administrator could tell me, of anything unusual happening in that specific location. It was just a bed. It had just, for reasons nobody could account for, become the one where a certain kind of visit reliably occurred. I left Aldrich Falls for a position in a larger hospital system 4 years ago, mostly for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this. Better pay, a partner's job relocated us. Ordinary reasons. I still keep in touch with Carol. Last I heard, they still try to keep bed 4 empty when the census allows it. And the newer nurses who've come through since I left have started asking, unprompted, the same questions I once asked her at 3 a.m. I don't know what to tell them, honestly. Beyond what I've told you, I checked every vital sign, every lab value, every possible medical explanation, every single time, and none of it explained what those patients described, or what the mattress showed, the nurses, when they went to check. For 11 years, I was one of maybe 4 physicians left in the entire country, as far as I could ever determine, who still did regular scheduled house calls as a core part of a rural practice rather than an occasional favor. I inherited the practice and the house call list along with it, from Dr. Weyer, not his real name, a man in his late 70s who had served the town of Corliss Bay, a fishing community on a cold water coastline I'll leave unspecified, for almost 50 years before retiring. When I bought the practice, he handed me 2 things: the keys to the clinic and a leather-bound ledger, handwritten, that listed every patient on his house call rotation, their addresses, their conditions, and the schedule on which he visited them, some as often as weekly, some just a few times a year. Dr. Weyer walked me through the ledger personally, over 2 afternoons, before he left town for good to live near his daughter inland. Most of the entries were exactly what you'd expect from a rural geriatric house call practice. Homebound elderly patients with mobility issues, a few with dementia, whose families couldn't manage regular clinic transport, a man with late-stage COPD who could no longer make the trip in from his place up the coast road. Straightforward continuity of care stuff, the kind of medicine that barely exists anymore, and that I'd taken the job specifically because I wanted to practice. Near the back of the ledger, in Dr. Weyer's careful hand, there was a final entry that didn't have a name attached the way the others did. It just read, "The Aldercroft House, quarterly. Do not skip. Do not bring students or shadowers. Knock twice. Wait. Knock twice again." When I asked him about it, he got quieter than he'd been for anything else in the ledger. He told me that the Aldercroft House was the last stop on a very old informal arrangement between the town's doctor and a family that had lived on the same isolated point of land, cut off from the rest of Corliss Bay by a tidal causeway that was only passable at low tide for as long as anyone could trace the town's medical records, which, in a place like Corliss Bay, meant a long time, since the church kept better records than the county for the better part of a century. He told me there was one person living in the house, an elderly woman he referred to only as Mrs. Aldercroft, and that his instructions from the doctor before him, because this arrangement had been passed down doctor to doctor, the same way the ledger itself was passed down, were to visit quarterly, never skip a visit even if she seemed fine and didn't want. 1, never bring a student, resident, or nurse along no matter how routine the visit seemed, and always knock exactly as described. Twice. A pause, twice again. I asked him what would happen if I didn't follow those instructions. He said he genuinely didn't know, because in 50 years he never once tested it, and the doctor before him had given him the same instructions with the same lack of explanation, and as far as he understood it, went back that way for as long as the ledger existed. He said only one thing more on the subject, which was that the previous doctor had told him something he'd never fully understood, but had never forgotten. You're not visiting her for her sake. You're visiting her for the town's. I want to be honest that I found this almost charming when I first heard it. The kind of small-town superstition that accretes around any long-running arrangement, especially in an isolated fishing community with its share of old maritime folklore about tides and causeways and things. Better left alone. I took over the practice. I took over the ledger. And for the first year, I visited the Aldercroft house exactly as instructed, quarterly, at low tide. Knock twice, pause, knock twice again. Mostly because it seemed easier to follow a harmless ritual than to be the new doctor in town who broke 50 years of tradition in his first month. Mrs. Aldercroft, when I met her, was unremarkable in almost every way that mattered clinically. Elderly, she would not give me an exact age, and there was no birth record for her that I, or apparently Dr. Weyer before me, had ever been able to locate in any county or church registry, which I initially assumed was simply a gap in old rural record keeping, common enough in that era. She lived alone in a well-kept but very old house at the end of the point. No visible family, no visitors that I ever saw evidence of. A small vegetable garden she maintained herself, and vital signs and a general physical presentation that were, frankly, remarkably good for whatever her true age was. Blood pressure of a much younger woman. No medications, no complaints. Each visit lasted maybe 20 minutes. I'd check her over. She'd offer me tea, which I always declined out of simple professional habit, and I'd leave. The only thing about the visits that consistently unsettled me, and it took me almost 2 years to admit to myself that it did, was that she always seemed to know things about the town's health that she had no ordinary way of knowing. Not dramatic things, small things. She'd mention, unprompted, that she hoped the Gerard boy's asthma was doing better this winter, when I hadn't seen the Gerard boy in months, and certainly hadn't mentioned him to her. She asked once whether old Pete Sinnett's heart had settled down since his spell, and Pete Sinnett had, in fact, had a minor cardiac event exactly 9 days before that visit. An event I hadn't discussed with anyone outside the clinic, and that hadn't yet made its way through the town's normally very efficient gossip network. Because Pete himself had asked me to keep it quiet from his sister for a few weeks, I never found a satisfying explanation for how she knew these things. And after the Pete Sinnett incident, I started, cautiously, testing her. I'd hold back information deliberately during clinic visits with other patients. Ask them not to mention a diagnosis to anyone yet. Tell no one, not even close family, and then wait to see if Mrs. Aldercroft mentioned it unprompted at the next quarterly visit. It happened enough times, with enough specificity, and with a short enough interval between the original event and her mentioning it, that ordinary town gossip stopped being an adequate explanation for me. I want to say clearly that I have no idea how she knew. I never once directly asked her, because every time I worked up the resolve to, something in the ordinary rhythm of the visit, her offering tea, asking about my own family, some perfectly mundane redirection, made the question feel, in the moment, both unnecessary and somehow unwise to press. The visit that ended this arrangement for me, 3 years into my tenure, was the one time I broke Dr. Weyer's instructions. And I broke them for what felt at the time like an unimpeachable clinical reason. I had a new resident doing a rural rotation with me for 6 weeks that spring. An eager, capable young woman I'll call Priya, doing a family medicine elective. Genuinely interested in the house call model of care, which was rare enough among residents that I wanted to encourage it. She asked to come along on the full rotation of house calls, and I brought her to every stop on the list except, initially, the Aldercroft house, following the instruction I'd inherited without ever fully understanding. She noticed the omission. Residents notice everything. It's what makes them good residents. And asked why one house was being skipped. I gave her some version of the truth, that it was an old family who preferred privacy, and that the prior doctor had asked that visits there be kept to just the covering physician. She pushed back, gently but persistently, on the grounds that, as a rotating resident, she was going to be a covering physician herself eventually and needed exposure to every kind of patient in a rural panel, including the ones who preferred privacy, which was, honestly, a completely reasonable professional argument. And I didn't have a better one to offer against it, beyond an instruction in a dead man's handwriting that I myself had never understood. I brought her along on the next quarterly visit. Mrs. Aldercroft answered the door. She always answered promptly, always before I'd finished the second set of 2 knocks. And for the first time in 3 years, her expression changed the moment she saw who was with me. Not anger exactly, something closer to the specific, weary disappointment of someone who has just watched an old arrangement, kept carefully for longer than most towns keep records, come apart over something as small as one visit. She let us both in. She was polite to Priya, entirely correct in every social sense, offered tea to both of us, answered every question Priya asked about her health history with patience. Nothing happened that I could point to as objectively alarming. But the visit was shorter than usual, maybe 12 minutes instead of the usual 20. And at the door, as we were leaving, she said something to me quietly enough that I don't think Priya heard it clearly. Something I have turned over in my head more times than I can count since. You'll want to check on the Harbor Road families a bit more closely this year. I won't be able to tell you as much anymore. I did not understand what she meant, and I did not get the chance to ask because I never saw Mrs. Aldercroft again after that visit. When I went out for the next scheduled quarterly call, 3 months later, the house was empty. Not abandoned in the sense of being left in disrepair, but cleared, cleaned, closed up properly, as if she had simply moved out in an orderly way sometime in the intervening months. No forwarding address, no record of her at the county level. Again, same as always. No one in town, including several older residents, who I would have expected to know something about a family that had apparently lived on that point for generations, could tell me anything definitive about who she was, where she'd come from, or where she might have gone. A few of the oldest residents remembered an Aldercroft woman as a fixture of the town for as long as they could remember, in a way that made me realize, uncomfortably, that some of them meant that literally, that the woman they remembered from their own childhoods and the woman I'd been visiting for 3 years were, as far as their memory served them, one and the same person, decades apart, which is obviously not something I can present as anything other than the unreliable recollection of elderly townspeople, and which I raise here only because more than one of them said some version of it independently without prompting when I asked around. The following winter, Corliss Bay had what the town still refers to as a bad flu year, a strain that hit harder and faster than the seasonal average, disproportionately affecting the older, more isolated households along the Harbor Road, exactly the cluster of families Mrs. Aldercroft had mentioned to me at the door. I lost 3 patients that winter that I don't think I would have lost if I'd been checking on that specific stretch of the road more proactively, the way I would have if I'd taken her comment as the direct instruction it now seems, in hindsight, obviously to have been rather than the vague pleasantry I filed it under at the time. I still have the ledger. Dr. Wire passed away 4 years ago. I never had the chance to ask him whether he had a fuller theory of what the Aldercroft arrangement actually was, or whether he simply followed the instruction the same way I eventually failed to. I've kept the entry in the ledger exactly as he wrote it, in case whoever takes the practice over from me someday needs to read it themselves. Quarterly, don't skip. No students knock twice. Wait, knock twice again. I don't have an explanation for any of it that I defend in front of a room of colleagues. I only have the empty house at the end of the causeway. 3 names I lost the following winter, and the specific, quiet way she said, "I won't be able to tell you as much anymore." Like an apology, and like a warning, delivered in the same 12 words, by someone who by every official record the county ever kept, did not, in any conventional sense, exist.